Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. My mother called at 7:12, her voice soft like she was announcing a death, but the news was weirder. My sister was suing me, and the family expected me to help pay for her lawyer. I stayed quiet just long enough to hear my apartment's air conditioner hum. In that freezing moment, I realized my family could no longer distinguish between the bleeding victim and the one holding the knife. My name is Faith Turner. I am 36 years old, and I live in a quiet, heavily sanitized apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina. By trade and by nature, I am the Director of Contract Compliance at Redline Civic Logistics. If you are entirely unfamiliar with the industry, Redline is a fictional entity to you, but in my reality, it is a massive firm that manages the invisible vital scaffolding of modern life. We handle infrastructure and complex supply chain operations for sprawling urban development projects. My job, stripped of all the exhausting corporate jargon, is to find the lie. I spend my days reading thousands of pages of dense contracts, searching for the hidden trapdoors, the buried liabilities, and the obscure clauses that allow people to walk away from their catastrophic messes while handing the bill to someone else. I am paid an exceptionally comfortable salary to be cynical, deeply detail-oriented, and utterly devoid of sentimentality when it comes to financial risk. It is a profound and bitter irony, then, that I failed to apply any of those sharp professional skills to my own bloodline. The phone call that completely shattered my carefully structured, predictable reality came at 7 on a Tuesday evening. I had just walked through my front door, slipping off my work heels and mentally preparing to heat up some leftover dinner when I saw my mother's name, Diane Turner, flash on the illuminated screen of my phone. A familiar, dull weight settled deep in my stomach. Conversations with my mother were never merely conversations. They were subtle, exhausting negotiations layered with historical guilt and unspoken demands. I answer on the third ring. I said hello, trying to sound as neutral as possible. My mother greeted me, her voice breathy, soft, and impossibly gentle. It was the exact delicate tone she used 5 years ago to tell me my great-aunt had passed away in her sleep. It was a voice engineered in a laboratory to cushion a devastating blow. I immediately shifted into problem-solving mode, asking what was wrong. That was my designated permanent role in the Turner family ecosystem. The fixer, the rational one, the emergency contact you call when the house is already on fire. My mother murmured that nothing was necessarily wrong. Sighing heavily into the receiver, she claimed it was just a little bump in the road regarding my sister, Orber. Of course, it was about Orber. Order Turner, older by 3 years, possessed a chaotic magnetic energy that the rest of the family routinely mistook for brilliant, entrepreneurial genius. I walked into my kitchen, turning on the harsh overhead lights, and asked what she had done this time. My mother quickly corrected me, her tone hardening just a fraction before returning to its manufactured softness. She insisted Orber had done nothing wrong. She stated that Orber was simply dealing with a little legal dispute. My mother prattled on about how complicated business could get, explaining that Order needed to secure a good attorney, and then lamented how outrageous legal fees had become these days. I opened the refrigerator, staring blankly at a row of sparkling water bottles. I acknowledged her point and waited for the inevitable request. My mother stretched her words out, explaining that the family was all trying to chip in to help Order out. She mentioned that she and my father were doing what they could, but things were a bit tight this quarter. Then came the strike. She said they needed $10,000 for the retainer. She told me they were hoping I could cover it just to get things started. $10,000. Spoken as casually as if she were asking me to pick up a carton of milk on my way home from the office. I closed the refrigerator door. The cool air dissipated against my warm skin. I kept my voice perfectly level, asking her to clarify the situation. I stated plainly that Order was involved in a lawsuit, and they wanted me to pay her lawyer $10,000. My mother reasoned with a nervous, fluttery cadence, calling it a loan or an investment, depending on how I wanted to look at it. She claimed Orber was just trying to protect her assets. I rubbed my temples, asking what assets she was talking about, and then asked the question that would end my life as I knew it. I asked who exactly Order was suing. The silence that followed on the line was not born of shock or shame. It was the calculated, breathless silence of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. The air conditioning unit in my apartment kicked into gear, sending a low, steady hum through the silent kitchen. Finally, my mother spoke. Her voice was entirely devoid of malice, as if she were stating a mundane fact about the weather outside. She told me that Orber was suing me. I froze. The words hung in the air, completely disjointed and surreal. I genuinely waited for her to laugh, to tell me it was a morbid joke, maybe a bizarre, twisted test of my loyalty to the family. But the silence remained thick and resolute. I repeated her words, the syllables tasting like gravel in my mouth. She was suing me. My mother rushed to speak, slipping effortlessly into the role of the beleaguered peacemaker, begging me not to get defensive. She assured me Orber was not trying to hurt me. She spun a narrative that Orber just felt she needed to claim her fair share. She said Orber had poured her heart and soul into the family project, and she felt like I had not honored my side of the partnership. She concluded by saying Orber was just trying to make things equitable. My side of the partnership, my fair share. The phrases made my stomach churn with a sickening blend of profound rage and sheer disbelief. There was no partnership. There was only me quietly signing checks and bailing out her disastrous attempts at playing an independent business owner. I spoke dangerously quiet, summarizing the absurdity of her call. I told her she was calling me to ask for $10,000 so that Orber could hire a lawyer to sue me. She pleaded with me, emphasizing that we were family, entirely missing the horrifying insanity of her own request. She insisted we had to support each other through these transitions. She claimed Orber just wanted to sit down at a mediation table, but she could not do that without formal representation. She reminded me that I had the money and she had the audacity to tell me it was the right thing to do. I did not hang up the phone because I felt weak. I did not hang up because I was overwhelmed by a sudden paralyzing sadness or betrayal. I hung up because I knew exactly what kind of ruthless monster lived inside my chest when I was pushed too far. If I had stayed on that line for 30 more seconds, I would have unleashed a torrent of venom that would have burned our family tree down to its absolute roots. I would have said things that could never ever be unsaid, unrecorded, or forgiven. So I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red button to end the call, and set the device face down on the cool marble surface of my kitchen island. I did not shed a single tear. I stood there perfectly still, listening to the mechanical hum of the air conditioner, feeling the strange, hollow calmness wash over my entire body. The next morning arrived with a cruel businesslike efficiency. At exactly 9:00, the precise minute standard office hours began. My phone chimed with a new voicemail notification. I was sitting at my dining table, a cup of untouched black coffee growing cold in front of me. I tapped the screen and brought the speaker up to my ear. A crisp, confident male voice greeted me. He introduced himself as Mitchell Bryce, the retaining counsel for my sister, Order Turner. He stated he was calling as a professional courtesy to inform me that his firm would be filing a civil complaint against me that afternoon in the county court. He boldly declared they were seeking damages in the amount of $350,000 stemming from my supposed breach of fiduciary duty and my failure to uphold my obligations in our alleged joint business venture. He ended the message by stating they believed it was in everyone's best interest to resolve this amicably, but they were fully prepared to litigate, and he advised me to have my legal counsel contact his office immediately. $350,000. I played the message again. Then I played it a third time. It was a phantom number, completely divorced from any actual financial reality. It was a staggering sum pulled from the thin air of Order's monumental unchecked entitlement. But as I listened to Mitchell Bryce's smooth, practiced voice looping over and over, the true suffocating weight of the situation finally settled over my shoulders. The devastating blow did not come from the threat of losing $350,000 with my corporate salary, my stock options, and my carefully managed savings. A prolonged legal battle would be financially painful, but it would not bankrupt me. I knew exactly how to fight ugly corporate wars. I could easily hire my own sharps to tear Mitchell Bryce apart in a deposition room. No, The real devastating strike came from the realization of what my mother's phone call truly meant in the grand scheme of my life. The very first strike of this war was not the lawsuit itself. The first strike was the terrifying, unshakable expectation that I would happily fund it. My parents, my own flesh and blood, had sat around a dining room table and genuinely concluded that it was perfectly reasonable to ask me to pay for the weapon that was about to be used to destroy me. I sat alone in my bright, sterile kitchen, staring at the black screen of my phone. The morning light poured through the tall windows, illuminating the tiny dust motes dancing lazily in the air. For 36 years, I had operated under the generous assumption that my family was just a little messy, a little dramatic, and perhaps a bit financially irresponsible. I had spent decades telling myself they meant well. But as I sat there in the blinding morning light, the veil finally dropped. I saw them clearly for the very first time in my entire existence. My family was not insane. They were not confused, and they were certainly not misguided. They had simply spent so many years bleeding my bank accounts dry that they had completely lost the cognitive ability to see me as an independent human being. They no longer knew the difference between the bleeding victim and the person holding the knife. To them, I was not a daughter and I was not a sister. I was simply an infinite, inexhaustible resource. And they fully expected me to open my wallet, smile, and pay for my own execution. I did not have a tragic childhood. Let me make that perfectly clear right from the start. Because people love to look for the origin of a villain in the ashes of a burned-down home or the bruises of a heavy hand. We grew up in the leafy, affluent suburbs of Asheville, surrounded by the majestic Blue Ridge Mountains, living in a colonial-style house with a perfectly manicured front lawn and a refrigerator that was never ever empty. There were no drunken brawls in our living room, no midnight escapes to a neighbor's house, no physical scars to hide under long winter sleeves. We were comfortably, solidly middle class, existing in a suffocating, insulated bubble of Southern politeness. But a childhood does not need to be a bloody tragedy to be a psychological trap. In the Turner household, the highest moral currency was not fairness, and it certainly was never the truth. The only virtue that mattered was loyalty, and loyalty in my parents' twisted translation meant fiercely protecting the family image, which almost exclusively meant protecting my sister from the consequences of her own nature. Orbra is exactly 3 years older than I am. From the very moment she could walk and articulate her demands, she was the undisputed gravitational center of our family. She was breathtakingly beautiful, possessing that effortless, radiant, golden girl charm that makes people instinctively want to forgive her for absolutely anything. At every neighborhood barbecue, every holiday dinner, every Sunday church service, order was the main event. She told the most engaging stories, laughed the loudest, and knew exactly how to make everyone in the room feel like they had been granted access to an exclusive, highly desirable club. She was the blinding sun, and the rest of us were simply expected to be grateful to be caught in her warm orbit. I, on the other hand, was the designated shadow. While Order was out mesmerizing a crowd and absorbing all the oxygen in the room, I was the one quietly gathering the discarded plastic cups, wiping down the sticky kitchen counters, and making sure the back door was securely locked before we went to sleep. My parents never explicitly sat me down and told me that I was the lesser daughter. The children are exceptionally fluent in the unspoken, heavy language of a household. The doubled standard was woven into the very fabric of our daily lives. Whenever Audra managed to do something even mildly impressive, like baking a slightly burnt peach cobbler or memorizing a short poem for a school assembly, my parents celebrated it as a manifestation of profound, undeniable talent. It was undeniable proof of her inherent specialness. But whenever I accomplished something genuinely difficult, like bringing home a flawless, straight a report card semester after semester, or organizing our chaotic, cluttered barrage over a sweltering summer weekend without being asked, it was simply classified as my duty. It was just faith being sensible. It was just faith being responsible. In our house, Audra's talent was celebrated as a gift to the world, while my discipline was merely an expected utility. This insidious, quiet dynamic only hardened into concrete as we grew out of adolescence and into adulthood. Audra's path through higher education was a spectacular, breathtakingly expensive disaster. She dropped out of 3 different university degree programs before her 24th birthday, citing the tragic lack of creative fulfillment each time she quit. After she abandoned academia entirely, she launched herself into a dizzying, chaotic series of half-baked business ventures. For exactly 8 months, she was a bespoke wedding decor consultant, a phase that resulted in her filling my parents' basement with thousands of dollars of imported imitation silk flowers, rustic mason jars, and yards of useless burlap. When that inevitably collapsed beneath the weight of unpaid invoices, she pivoted abruptly to organizing boutique pop-up events in downtown Asheville that barely broke even, leaving a trail of frustrated vendors in her wake. Yet, through every single failure, through every squandered investment and abandoned project, my parents nodded in profound, delusional admiration. They proudly told their friends at the country club that Audra possessed a rare entrepreneurial spirit. They called her a visionary, claiming she had a wild, untamed creative genius that simply could not be confined to a traditional, soul-crushing office environment. They rebranded her flakiness as artistic temperament. Meanwhile, I took the path of absolute grinding, unglamorous discipline. I completed my rigorous 4-year finance and business degree in exactly 4 years, graduating at the very top of my class while working 25 hours a week at a local logistics firm just to avoid drowning in student loan debt. I took a grueling, demanding entry-level job in corporate compliance, working 60-hour weeks, studying the intricate, maddening language of commercial contracts, and ruthlessly climbing the corporate ladder based on sheer, undeniable competence. I earned every single promotion. I fought for every raise. I commanded every ounce of professional respect I received. Yet, whenever I shared a major career milestone at the family dinner table, whether it was a promotion to senior analyst or being named a director before I turned 35, the reaction was always exactly the same. I would receive a polite, tepid nod from my father, followed invariably by a long, wistful sigh from my mother about how the universe had just smiled so brightly upon me. They told me I was the lucky one. They looked at my exhausted, sleep-deprived face at the years of relentless, agonizing grind and decided that my success was merely a fortunate accident. They convinced themselves it was just a lucky break that made life so much easier for me than it was for my struggling, brilliant, perpetually misunderstood sister. It was the ultimate unforgivable eraser of my effort, designed entirely to protect Audra's fragile ego. The true catalyst for our current nightmare, however, did not emerge from a corporate boardroom. It emerged from a lawyer's office following a funeral. When our maternal grandmother passed away just over 3 years ago, her will revealed that she had left behind the family's most cherished, historically significant, and entirely impractical asset, the Magnolia Trace Inn. It was an old sprawling wooden bed and breakfast sitting right on the muddy edge of a picturesque lake just outside the city limits. To the naked, untrained eye, it was a southern postcard brought to vivid life, complete with wide wraparound porches, ancient weeping willows sweeping the water, and an overwhelming heavy sense of historic romance. But my brain is permanently wired to look past the romance. I do not look at aging buildings with a sense of nostalgia. I look at them with the cold, unforgiving, clinical gaze of a corporate auditor. When the deed was officially transferred to our family trust, I was the very first person to walk through those creaky, heavy oak doors and see the property for what it truly terrifyingly was, a massive sinking financial liability. Where my family saw rustic charm, I saw a shingled roof that was at least 15 years past its maximum warranty. I saw a stone foundation that was almost certainly compromised by decades of unchecked lakeside moisture. I saw a terrifying lack of modern commercial fire suppression systems, a wildly outdated electrical grid that was a blatant code violation, and annual property taxes that would swallow a modest salary whole. I sat down at the dining room table, laid out a preliminary spreadsheet, and immediately suggested we sell the property as is, take whatever cash we could get from a developer, and invest the proceeds safely for our parents' retirement. Audra predictably saw something entirely different, where I saw a gaping, ravenous money pit. She saw a grand illuminated stage. She walked through those dusty, decaying, drafty rooms and instantly cast herself in the starring role of a magnificent production. She saw herself as the elegant, visionary hostess of a resurrected Southern dream, gliding effortlessly through the polished halls, greeting wealthy, sophisticated guests and hosting lavish magazine cover wellness retreats. She weaponized our grandmother's memory, passionately convincing my parents that selling the inn to a faceless developer would be a grotesque betrayal of our family's sacred legacy. She painted a vivid, intoxicating, utterly fictional picture of a revitalized Magnolia Trace, framing it as a booming exclusive boutique destination that would finally undeniably showcase her boundless entrepreneurial talents to the entire world. And my parents, deeply and tragically addicted to the long-standing fantasy of Order's imminent success, bought every single word of her pitch without looking at a single number. They handed her the keys to the kingdom, entirely ignoring the glaring, indisputable fact that my sister had never successfully balanced a basic business ledger in her entire life. They gave her the magnificent stage she had always craved. And true to the fundamental, unbreakable law of the Turner family dynamic, they silently, implicitly expected me to remain quietly in the shadows, holding the broom, completely ready to clean up the inevitable, catastrophic mess when the velvet curtain finally fell. Mother Nature is exceptionally cruel to romantic ideals. It only took 2 brutal Appalachian storm seasons to strip away the quaint, historic veneer of the Magnolia Trace Inn and expose the rotting wood underneath. The picturesque weeping willows dropped massive heavy branches onto the wraparound porch during a late summer gale, shattering the ancient railing. A winter freeze ruptured a main pipe in the eastern wing, flooding 3 guest suites with murky, freezing water before anyone even noticed. Almost overnight, the charming family heirloom transformed into a relentless, gaping M that consumed cash faster than anyone could print it. My parents panicked. Their retirement savings suddenly threatened by the very legacy they had fought so hard to preserve. Order, however, did not panic. She simply pivoted. She called a family meeting in my parents' living room, armed with glossier printed mood boards she had clearly ordered online. She waved away the structural water damage as a minor cosmetic setback and passionately argued that this was actually a blessing in disguise. She declared that we needed to stop catering to budget tourists and instead transform the inn into a premier high-end destination for luxury weddings and exclusive corporate wellness retreats. She tossed around phrases she had blatantly stolen from business, insisting all she needed was a little bridge capital to cross the valley of transition. I sat on the edge of the sofa listening to her pitch and felt a familiar deep exhaustion settle into my bones. Bridge capital is a term used by actual investors to describe temporary financing. In Order's mouth, it was just a prettier, more sophisticated way of asking for a bailout. Initially, I only stepped in to handle the absolute, unavoidable emergencies. I did not do it because I believed in her luxury retreat vision. I did it because my parents were terrified and the math was entirely in my favor to stop the bleeding early. When the county sent a bright pink notice threatening to place a tax lien on the property due to severely delinquent property taxes, I quietly logged into the municipal portal and paid the balance in full to avoid the compounding penalties. When the water mitigation company sent over a densely worded, highly aggressive contract that would have allowed them to put a mechanic's lien on the inn if their inflated invoices were not paid within 15 days. I redlined the document, stripped out their predatory clauses, and forced them to accept a standard net 30 payment term. I spent my late evenings arguing with insurance adjusters over depreciation schedules for waterlogged antique carpets. These were logical defensive maneuvers. I was protecting a physical asset, but the fundamental problem with putting out fires for someone who constantly plays with matches is that they simply learn to stop carrying water. The request slowly mutated from administrative help into direct, heavy financial demands. Order would call me in the middle of my workday, her voice tight with manufactured panic, claiming a contractor was threatening to walk off the job if they did not get a materials deposit that very afternoon. I wired $4,000 to a roofing company just to stop the main dining hall from sustaining further water damage. 2 months later, I received a frantic text message stating that the local utility provider was scheduled to cut off the electricity to the entire property by 500. I paid $6,500 to clear the massive backlog of unpaid heating and electric bills. The most infuriating demand came right before the spring wedding season. Audra had wildly overpromised on a renovation timeline to a wealthy bridal party, and when the bridal suite was not finished, the bride canceled the entire weekend and threatened a lawsuit. Audra called me sobbing hysterically, saying her entire reputation was on the line. I transferred $9,000 to cover the immediate refund of the client's deposit solely to prevent a very public, highly damaging breach of contract claim from hitting the local court docket. I never once viewed a single cent of that money as an investment in her business. I did not want equity. I did not want to say in the paint colors or the catering menus. I viewed every wire transfer, every cleared check, and every late-night contract review as a damage control tax. It was the heavy price I paid to keep my parents from having a stress-induced heart attack. It was the familiar toxic trap of high-functioning capability. I could afford to fix it. I knew how to fix it, and therefore it became my unspoken obligation to fix it. But as the cash continued to flow from my bank account into the black hole of the inn, Audra began to subtly alter the narrative. She started dropping vague inclusive pronouns whenever she spoke to vendors, local business owners, or our extended family. It started small. I would overhear her on the phone talking about how we were finalizing the new floor plans or how the sisters' project was really taking off. It made my skin crawl. It felt like a subtle theft of my identity, a deliberate attempt to blur the hard, defining line between her chaotic failures and my quiet financial solvency. Yet, I swallowed the irritation. I told myself it was just Audra being Audra, inflating her own importance by attaching herself to my stability. It was annoying, but it did not feel dangerous enough to start a war over. That fragile tolerance violently snapped during a Sunday dinner at my parents' house in late October. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, the table groaning under the weight of a heavy roast and too many side dishes. Audra had invited a local event planner she was desperately trying to impress, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard resting on the floor next to her chair. Midway through the meal, the planner asked how our family managed the stress of running such a massive, complicated hospitality venture. Audra smiled radiantly, swirling her red wine in her glass with practiced elegance. She leaned forward and confidently announced that we had a perfectly balanced system. She looked right at the event planner and stated with absolute, unwavering conviction that Faith handles the strategy, the boring contracts, and the financial back end, while she personally handles the vision, the aesthetics, and the client relationships. She waved her hand gracefully toward me across the table, acting for all the world as if a legitimate, legally binding family partnership actually existed. The fork in my hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. I placed it down on the edge of my porcelain plate. The soft clink of the metal against the china sounded like a gunshot in my own ears. I looked directly at my sister. The warm ambient lighting of the dining room seemed to instantly turn harsh and clinical. I kept my voice perfectly even, devoid of any anger, utilizing the exact same flat, precise tone I used in corporate boardrooms when a vendor tried to slip an unauthorized fee into a final invoice. I corrected her. I stated clearly, enunciating every single word, that I did not handle the strategy or the financial back end. I told the table, and specifically the guest, that I was simply a private lender who occasionally reviewed legal documents to ensure the property did not go into foreclosure. I explicitly stated that I was not a partner. I had no operational control, and I assumed zero liability for the business. The immediate aftermath was spectacular in its awkwardness. The event planner's eyes darted nervously between my sister and me, her polite smile freezing on her face. Audra's golden, radiant expression completely shattered, replaced instantly by a flushed, tight-lipped mask of pure, unadulterated humiliation. Nobody liked the truth. My mother abruptly stood up and began loudly gathering empty plates that did not need to be gathered, aggressively changing the subject to the autumn weather. My father suddenly found the label on his beer bottle utterly fascinating. The entire dining room plunged into a very specific, incredibly dense type of family silence. It was not the silence of people realizing they were wrong. It was the suffocating, resentful silence reserved exclusively for the person who had just ruined a perfectly good illusion. In their eyes, I had not clarified a crucial legal distinction. I had simply been cruel. I was the villain who had selfishly destroyed the pleasant mood of a Sunday dinner by refusing to play my assigned role in my sister's magnificent delusion. My name is Faith Turner. For years, I had accepted the role of the reliable shadow, the one who quietly handled the unpleasant realities while my sister, Audra, basked in the manufactured sunlight of my family's approval. But the inevitable breaking point did not happen with a screaming match. It happened with a perfectly standard two-page loan application. 3 weeks after that stifling Sunday dinner, where I publicly denied being Audra's business partner, my sister finally reached the absolute limit of her bridge capital. The contractors stopped returning her calls. The local vendors demanded cash upfront, and her credit cards were hopelessly maxed out. Her brilliant visionary pivot to save the Magnolia Trace Inn was to refinance the property entirely with a massive commercial loan. She went to a regional bank, armed with her glossy mood boards and her intoxicating charm. The loan officer, who was entirely immune to Golden Girl charisma, took one look at her abysmal debt-to-income ratio and flatly denied the application. He told her she needed a guarantor with impeccable credit and a highly verifiable bulletproof income to even get the paperwork onto an underwriter's desk. My parents did not even pause to consider the implications. They simply turned their heads toward Charlotte and dialed my number. They assumed I would sign the guarantor agreement as reflexively as I breathed. In their minds, my paycheck was the prettiest in the family, and my credit score, hovering effortlessly above 800, was the cleanest. It was a mere formality. It was just another piece of paper for Faith to review and sign so Audra could get back to building her dream. I told them I would not put my signature on a federal banking document without seeing the preliminary financial reports Audra had submitted to the loan officer. Audra fought this fiercely, accusing me of trying to micromanage her creative process, but the bank's deadline was looming. Reluctantly, she emailed me a zip file containing her ledgers, her projected revenue spreadsheets, and her accounts payable. I sat at my dining table on a Friday night, poured a glass of cold water, and opened the files. It took me less than 45 minutes to find the rot. The numbers were not just bad, they were actively fabricated. The projected booking revenue was massively inflated, including reservations for dates that had already passed with no corresponding deposits. I found 3 separate instances where heavy machinery invoices had been duplicated and entered twice to artificially inflate the supposed value of the capital improvements. Worst of all, the substantial cash deposits from future brides, money that legally needed to sit in a pristine escrow account, were completely missing from the main ledger. The cash flow was not weak. It was a terminal hemorrhage covered by a thin layer of accounting fraud. I called my parents and my sister on a joint line the very next morning. I kept my voice stripped of all emotion. I walked them through the discrepancies, line by cruel line. I explained that I was not declining because I was afraid of a temporary market dip or a slow season. I was declining because the entire management model was fundamentally rotting from the inside out. Signing that commercial loan would not be an act of familial support. It would be an act of financial suicide. Strapping myself to the anchor of a sinking fraudulent ship, Audra did not argue the numbers. She did not attempt to explain the missing deposits or the duplicated invoices. Instead, she inhaled sharply and weaponized the rejection. She screamed into the receiver that I was a jealous, vindictive saboteur. To her, my refusal to underwrite her disaster was a public, calculated betrayal of our sisterhood. She hung up the phone so hard I heard the plastic receiver crack against the cradle. 14 days later, the temperature in my family dropped below freezing. Audra sent a massive multi-page email to every single relative from my parents down to our second cousins in Georgia. She crafted a masterful, agonizing narrative of victimhood. She described me as the wealthy corporate sister who had promised her the world, who had deliberately built up her hopes, encouraged her to take massive risks with our grandmother's legacy, and then, at the very last second, pulled the ladder away just as she was reaching the top. The effect was instantaneous and chilling. My parents stopped calling to check on me. The family group chat went completely dead. When I tried to call my father to discuss a medical appointment he had coming up, his tone was entirely unfamiliar. It was clipped, formal, and coated in a layer of profound disappointment. I had crossed the invisible sacred boundary. I had stopped being the reliable safety net and had transformed into the enemy of the family's chosen protagonist. Then came the ultimate escalation. It arrived not via a passive-aggressive email, but via a stern-faced process server who walked directly into the glass-walled lobby of Redline Civic Logistics on a Tuesday afternoon. He handed me a thick manila envelope right in front of the reception desk. Mitchell Bryce had officially filed the civil complaint. I sat in my private office, locked the heavy wooden door, and read the document. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction. The lawsuit officially alleged that I had entered into a binding 5,050 oral partnership with order to redevelop the Magnolia Trace Inn. It claimed that my previous payments to contractors and utility companies were not emergency loans, but explicit capital contributions confirming my equity stake. But the most venomous lie was buried in the fourth section of the complaint. Order's lawyer formally accused me of promising to leverage my high-level corporate network at Redline to bring lucrative executive retreat contracts exclusively to the inn. The suit claimed I had deliberately withheld these fictional contracts to choke the business model, starving the property of revenue so I could forcefully seize complete operational control for myself at a fraction of the market value. She was demanding $350,000 in lost prospective revenue and punitive damages. She had constructed an entire alternate reality where my refusal to be bled dry was actually a Machiavellian plot to steal her empire. The sheer audacity of the document left me numb, but the true sickening twist of the knife came 48 hours later, bringing the entire nightmare into razor-sharp focus. It was the phone call from my mother, the one I took standing in my kitchen, the one where she calmly stated that Order was suing me and then immediately asked me for $10,000 to help pay for Mitchell Bryce's retainer. When I finally pushed past the shock and forced my mother to explain herself, the terrifying psychology of my family laid itself bare. They did not care about the fabricated invoices. They did not care that Order had perjured herself by inventing a 5,050 oral contract that never existed. They did not even care about the weaponized email she had used to turn her extended family against me. Right and wrong had completely vanished from their vocabulary. My mother spoke to me with the exhausted, patient tone of a parent dealing with a stubborn toddler. She told me that Order was very hurt and very determined. She framed the lawsuit not as an aggressive attack on my livelihood, but as Order's brave attempt to validate her feelings and find her voice. And then, without a single ounce of irony, my mother suggested that the only way to make this horrible tension go away was for me to step up and act like an adult. Acting like an adult in her twisted lexicon meant I needed to contribute to Order's legal fund. She genuinely believed that if I just handed over the cash to the lawyer who was currently trying to ruin my life, Order could see this case through, get it out of her system, and we could all finally go back to being a happy, cohesive family. They were not asking me to surrender. They were demanding that I actively finance my own crucifixion just to keep the peace. The boundary between family and enemy had not just been crossed. It had been entirely erased. And in that cold, sterile kitchen, staring at the legal complaint sitting on my counter, I realized that playing defense was no longer an option. If they wanted to stop acting like my blood and start speaking to me entirely in the language of the law, I was finally ready to reply in kind. I did not hire a family friend, and I certainly did not hire a local attorney who might be susceptible to Southern charm or polite small-town networking. I drove to the most sterile, aggressively modern office building in downtown Charlotte and retained Celeste W. She was a senior civil litigator whose entire professional reputation was built on ruthlessly dismantling lawsuits that were constructed out of wounded feelings and fabricated grievances. She was famously devoid of bedside manner, which was exactly what I required. I sat in her immaculate glass-walled conference room and watched her read through the 50-page complaint Mitchell Bryce had filed. She did not sigh, and she did not shake her head. She simply turned the pages with mechanical precision. When she reached the final paragraph, she closed the manila folder and folded her hands on the heavy oak table. She looked at me and delivered her assessment with absolutely zero sugar. She stated that the case was structurally pathetic. She noted that relying on an unrecorded, undocumented oral partnership for a six-figure rural commercial real estate venture was legally laughable. However, she leaned forward and made her warning perfectly clear. She told me that while the case was weak, it was precisely the kind of weak that was designed to be deeply annoying. It was a parasite. She explained that if we simply played a passive defense, Audra and her attorney would drag the discovery process out for 18 months, bleeding my bank accounts dry through endless motions and depositions. Celeste told me that the only way to kill a frivolous lawsuit was to respond with such overwhelming aggressive force that the opposing counsel realized they had stepped on a landmine. I gave her the authorization to do whatever was necessary. Then I went home and officially cut the cord. I initiated a complete and total communication blackout with the Turner family. It was a terrifyingly quiet process. I simply stopped answering the phone. My screen would light up with relentless frequency. My mother called twice a day. My father, Russell Turner, left thick, uncomfortable silences on my answering machine. My Aunt Paula, who suddenly fancied herself a seasoned diplomatic envoy, sent lengthy text messages about the sacred bonds of blood. Even two of my younger cousins, who usually only spoke to me on Thanksgiving, suddenly emerged from the woodwork, offering to act as impartial mediators. In my family's vocabulary, mediation was simply a polite synonym for forcing the reasonable person to capitulate to the unreasonable one. I deleted their messages without listening to them. The only person who truly understood the profound shift occurring inside me was Noel Mercer. Noel and I had been dating for 4 years. As a school psychologist, his entire career was dedicated to identifying deeply ingrained behavioral patterns and dismantling toxic environments. He did not possess the typical reflexive instinct to protect the family unit at all costs. On a rainy Sunday evening, as I was sitting on my living room floor, surrounded by stacks of printed bank statements, Noah brought me a cup of tea and sat down beside me. He looked at the mountain of paperwork, then looked into my eyes. He did not ask what I was planning to do for my parents. He did not ask how we could fix the fractured dynamic. He simply placed his hand over mine and asked with devastating clarity how much longer I was going to force myself to endure this. It was the first time in my 36 years of life that someone had looked at my family and identified me as the victim of their mechanics, rather than the designated shock absorber. With Noah's quiet validation grounding me, I began the grueling task of gathering my own evidence for Celeste. I requested 7 years of complete transaction histories from my banks. I exported thousands of text messages, archived emails, and itemized cell phone logs. I did not just pull the records related to the Magnolia Trace, and I organized the data chronologically, spreading the papers across my living room. A deeply chilling pattern materialized right in front of my eyes. It was the forensic accounting of my family's affection. I tracked a direct, undeniable correlation between their warmth and their financial need. Every single time my mother had sent a randomly affectionate text message calling me her sweet girl, it was followed within 48 hours by a phone call detailing a sudden, unexpected expense. Every time my father had praised my corporate success at a family gathering, Audra had approached me the very next week with a business proposal she needed me to underwrite. Their love was not a baseline. It was a softening tactic. The realization did not make me cry. It simply made me feel incredibly cold, as if someone had opened a window in my chest and let the winter air inside. I needed to see them one last time to confirm it. I needed to look them in the eye and make sure I was not the one losing my grip on reality. I drove 2 hours west to Asheville on a Tuesday morning, parking my car in the driveway of my childhood home. I walked through the unlocked front door and found my parents sitting at the kitchen table. The air in the house was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of stale coffee and profound anxiety. When they saw me, My mother gasped and clutched her chest while my father rigidly set his mud down. I did not sit. I stood on the opposite side of the kitchen island and demanded to know exactly where they had gotten the $10,000 to pay Mitchell Bryce's retainer. I knew my parents' financial landscape intimately. They did not have that kind of liquid cash sitting idly in a checking account. My mother's eyes instantly filled with tears, her lower lip trembling as she looked away. She stammered, her voice dropping to a defensive whisper. She confessed that she had gone to the local credit union the previous week. She had opened a home equity line of credit against the very house we were standing in. She had borrowed against the roof over her own head to hand cash to a lawyer whose sole mandate was to sue her youngest daughter. A wave of absolute nausea washed over me. I slammed my hand down on the marble counter, my voice echoing sharply off the kitchen cabinets. I told them they were completely out of their minds. I warned them clearly and explicitly that they were using hard physical assets to finance a total fabrication. I explained that Order's lawsuit was a ghost built on lies and forged memories, and when it inevitably collapsed, the bank was still going to demand their monthly payments. My mother just covered her face with her hands and sobbed loudly. Through her tears, she kept repeating the same deeply programmed script. She wailed that Order was finally standing up for her rights, that she was finally claiming her worth, and that I was being cruel by trying to tear her down just when she was finding her voice. I turned my gaze to my father. Russell Turner had been a quiet man in my entire life, preferring to let my mother handle the emotional turbulence while he maintained a stoic distance. I stared at him silently, begging him to intervene, to step up and act like the patriarch of the family, to recognize the catastrophic financial cliff they were actively driving toward. My father did not look at my face. He kept his eyes entirely locked on his coffee mug when he finally spoke. His voice was flat, hollow, and devoid of any parental warmth. He told me that I'd understood paperwork better than anyone else in the family. He said that with my salary and my connections, I had more than enough ability to make this entire situation disappear. If I really wanted to, the words hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was not just asking for money. He was actively punishing me for having boundaries. He was punishing me for succeeding in a way his favored child had not. I did not argue. I did not scream. I turned around and walked out of the house, letting the heavy front door click shut behind me. As I walked down the driveway toward my car, the crisp mountain air hitting my face, I felt a sensation that was far worse than simple betrayal. Betrayal implies a sudden break in trust. This was a confirmation of a lifelong dynamic. I realized with absolute certainty that I had been drafted into a deeply unfair social contract at birth. My family had subconsciously agreed that they were allowed to be reckless, delusional, and collectively insane solely because they knew I would always be there to absorb the impact. I was the designated rational adult, the structural beam they could endlessly chip away at without fearing the roof would collapse. But as I started my engine and pulled out of the driveway, leaving my childhood home in the rear view mirror, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. They had demanded that I speak the language of the law, and now I was going to show them exactly how fluent I was. The rescue mode was permanently deactivated. The structural beam had just removed itself from the building. In the sterile fluorescent-lit world of civil litigation, the discovery phase is where the lies are supposed to go to die. It is the grueling, deeply unglamorous process of exchanging evidence where the sweeping dramatic claims made in a preliminary lawsuit must suddenly be supported by hard, verifiable documentation. It is the legal equivalent of turning on the harsh basement lights to see exactly where the roaches scatter. I had spent my entire professional career swimming in deep oceans of corporate data, so when Mitchell Bryce officially submitted his initial packet of evidentiary disclosures, I did not feel fear. I felt a cold predatory anticipation. I sat in Celeste Wynn's downtown office on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The city skyline outside her floor-to-ceiling windows was obscured by heavy gray clouds, but inside, the atmosphere was crackling with sharp-focused energy. Celeste placed a thick, neatly bound stack of printed papers onto the center of her massive oak desk. She did not say a word. She merely tapped the top page with her manicured index finger and leaned back in her leather chair. I picked up the packet. It was a collection of printed screenshots purportedly capturing a long detailed text message thread between Orbra and myself. According to these images, we had engaged in a deeply involved collaborative conversation about the future of the Magnolia Trace in approximately 10 months ago. I read the words I had supposedly typed. My digital ghost sounded remarkably enthusiastic. The fabricated version of me enthusiastically agreed to cover the ongoing operational losses, provided that we agreed to split the eventual profits straight down the middle. There were multiple messages where I supposedly offered strategic advice on marketing the property, ending with a cheerful declaration that we were going to make a fortune together. It was a masterful, deeply unsettling piece of fiction. Reading words you never wrote presented back to you as undeniable legal fact induces a very specific type of psychological vertigo. For a fraction of a second, you actually question your own sanity. You wonder if you suffered a localized amnesia. Then the analytical side of my brain violently kicked in, overriding the shock. I tossed the packet back onto the desk. I looked at Celeste and stated flatly that I had never written a single syllable of that conversation. Celeste smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, carnivorous grin of a trial lawyer who had just found blood in the water. She pulled a silver pen from her pocket and began systematically dismantling the printed pages. She pointed out the visual discrepancies with terrifying precision. The font kerning in my supposed text bubbles was slightly compressed, a telltale sign of a third-party image generator rather than a native operating system screenshot. She highlighted the timestamps, noting that several of my most enthusiastic responses were supposedly sent at 3:00 in the morning on a Wednesday, an hour when my building security alarms could easily prove I was asleep and my phone was securely docked on my nightstand on the Do Not Disturb setting. Most damning of all, Celeste noted the interface layout. The text bubbles and battery icons at the top of the screenshots perfectly mimicked an Android operating system. I had exclusively used a corporate Apple device for the past 8 years. Orbra had not just exaggerated a conversation. She had deliberately, painstakingly manufactured an entire digital history to support her completely baseless lawsuit. But fabricated text messages were only the shallow end of the dissection. Celeste, recognizing that Orbra was perfectly willing to manufacture evidence, immediately filed a barrage of aggressive subpoenas targeting the state corporation registry, the local municipal tax boards, and the regional banks operating in the Asheville area. She demanded every single piece of paper bearing the name of the inn or my sister. 2 weeks later, the physical boxes arrived from the financial institutions. It was during our rigorous review of these bank statements and incorporation documents that the true terrifying architecture of Orbra's scheme finally came to light. Celeste found the smoking gun buried in a stack of state filing receipts. It was a formal registration for a limited liability company. The entity was named Turner Heritage Hospitality. I stared at the official state seal stamped on the corner of the paper. I checked the date of incorporation. The LLC had been legally formed exactly 8 months ago. That timeline clicked into place with horrifying clarity. 8 months ago was precisely the moment Orbra had started casually dropping the phrase "the sisters project" into her conversations with local vendors and our parents. She was not just inflating her ego. She was laying the verbal groundwork for a paper trail. Celeste slid the operating agreement across the desk toward me. I scanned the lines of boilerplate legal text until I reached the ownership structure. The air rushed completely out of my lungs. There, printed in stark black ink, was my name, Faith Turner. But I was not just listed as a passive investor. I was officially designated as the managing member of Turner Heritage Hospitality. Right below my printed name was a digital signature stamp, a sterile automated DocuSign authorization linked to an email address that was a slight clever misspelling of my actual corporate email. I had never seen this document before in my life. I had never clicked an authorization link. I had been drafted into the commanding role of a corporate entity without my knowledge, my consent, or my actual signature. But the nightmare did not end with a forged operating agreement. An LLC is merely an empty vessel until you fill it with liability. Celeste flipped to the next folder, her expression hardening into a mask of pure professional fury. She produced a commercial lending agreement from a mid-sized regional bank. Turner Heritage Hospitality had applied for and successfully secured a revolving business line of credit. The approved limit was $75,000. I scanned the attached financial disclosures used to secure the loan. The application was anchored entirely by my pristine financial profile. Someone had submitted my W-2 tax forms, a highly detailed summary of my corporate salary, and a spotless credit report to convince the bank's underwriters that the LLC was a virtually risk-free investment. I realized with sickening certainty how she had obtained those documents. I had emailed that exact financial packet to my parents 2 years ago when I was helping them navigate a complex mortgage refinancing process. Audra must have dug through their unsecure home computer to find the files, harvesting my financial identity to build her fraudulent empire. I looked at the current balance on the bank statement. The $75,000 line of credit was completely maxed out. It had been drained down to the very last cent, siphoned off to pay for her disastrous, mismanaged vendor contracts and her escalating personal expenses. In that perfectly quiet, temperature-controlled office, the entire lawsuit suddenly shifted focus. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together, forming a picture far more sinister than a simple family shakedown. The lawsuit was never about winning $350,000 in a courtroom. That massive, terrifying number was just a bright, flashing distraction. It was a psychological weapon designed to panic me into seeking a quick, quiet resolution. Audra knew the $75,000 debt bomb was ticking loudly in the background, and she knew she had no way to pay it back. Her master plan was incredibly dark and highly calculated. She was suing me for a breach of an oral partnership, hoping I would eventually cave to the family pressure and agree to a moderate settlement just to make the nightmare end. But by agreeing to any settlement that acknowledged our joint venture, I would be inadvertently validating the existence of the partnership. I would be legally cementing my fabricated status as the managing member of Turner Heritage Hospitality. She was trying to legally bind me to the sinking ship before the bank realized the captain was a fraud. She wanted to trap me in a position where I would be forced to personally guarantee and absorb her $75,000 debt, leaving her completely free to walk away from the wreckage she had created. When Celeste formally confronted opposing counsel with our findings, demanding an immediate explanation for the forged corporate documents, Mitchell Bryce's office scrambled. They sent back a hastily drafted, incredibly weak response. They claimed the LLC registration and the loan application were merely the result of an administrative oversight. They blamed a temporary freelance bookkeeper for a harmless paperwork mix-up, insisting Audra had never intended to formally list me as a managing member without my explicit written consent. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, and Celeste treated it with the absolute contempt it deserved. She closed the heavy cardboard boxes and looked across the desk at me. She declared that we were no longer just playing defense. We were no longer simply trying to swat away a frivolous civil complaint. We were going to war. Celeste immediately began outlining a massive, devastating counterclaim. We were going to sue Audra for civil fraud, for the blatant abuse of the legal process, and for the unauthorized, malicious use of my financial identity. I walked out of Celeste's office and stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflective. I watched the city traffic moving in a blur of red and white lights. For my entire life, I had viewed my sister as a chaotic, wildly entitled, fundamentally selfish child who simply refused to grow up. I had excused her behavior as a byproduct of our parents' endless coddling. But the discovery phase had permanently destroyed that illusion. Audra was not a misguided dreamer. She was a survivalist willing to burn the entire forest down just to keep her own hands warm. She had looked at her impending financial ruin and made a conscious, deliberate decision. She had decided that if she could not win this game by telling the truth, she would simply construct a labyrinth of smoke and mirrors, perfectly willing to destroy my life, my credit, and my future to save herself. The sister I thought I knew was dead. In her place stood a very real, very dangerous adversary, and I was finally ready to destroy her. There is a distinct, sharp difference between someone who is merely bad at business and someone who is actively operating a scam. To bridge that gap, to transform my suspicions into irrefutable weaponized evidence, Celeste brought in Gideon Vale. Gideon was a forensic accountant, a man who possessed a quiet, almost unsettling passion for spreadsheets that lied. He was a slight, soft-spoken man who wore wire-rimmed glasses and possessed the clinical detachment of a mortician. He did not care about my family dynamics, the emotional abuse, or the history of favoritism. Gideon only cared about the mathematics of dissection. For a week, Gideon locked himself in a windowless conference room at Celeste's firm, surrounded by the towering stacks of subpoenaed bank records, the credit card statements from Turner Heritage Hospitality, and the disorganized, chaotic ledgers Audra had submitted to the bank. When he finally emerged and summoned us into the room, he did not look triumphant. He simply looked like a man who had scraped away a beautiful glossy layer of fresh paint only to find a structure completely devoured by termites. We sat across from him as he projected a massively complex color-coded flowchart onto the wall. Gideon began the presentation with the wedding deposits. He traced the journey of the cash with chilling precision. When a prospective bride wrote a check for a $5,000 deposit to secure the Magnolia Trace in for a spring weekend, that money was legally required to sit completely untouched in a designated escrow account. Instead, Gideon showed us the exact hour. The funds cleared the business account and were immediately fractured. $2,000 might go toward a legitimate utility bill, but the remaining $3,000 were instantly transferred via a mobile banking application directly into Audra's personal checking account. She was using the future operational capital of the inn as her own private, highly liquid ATM. But the casual embezzlement of client deposits was only the first layer of the rot. Gideon moved to the expense columns, his laser pointer hovering over a series of massive outflows, aggressively categorized as emergency structural repairs. I remembered those months. Those were the exact same weeks Audra had called me, in a manufactured panic, weeping about burst pipes and failing foundations, begging for my financial help to keep the doors open. Gideon pulled the corresponding vendor receipts. The emergency repairs were not lumber, drywall, or plumbing services. They were invoices from high-end boutique interior design firms. Audra had used the LLC's drained funds to purchase a custom-made emerald green velvet sectional sofa, imported brass light fixtures, and an antique Persian rug, and none of these items were delivered to the Magnolia Trace Inn. The shipping manifests explicitly proved that every single piece of luxury furniture had been delivered directly to the upscale, two-bedroom condominium Audra's was renting in downtown Asheville. She had financed a spectacular magazine-quality personal lifestyle using the inn as a fraudulent cover story, the most brazen, breathtaking act of financial theft, however, involved a single devastating invoice. Gideon highlighted a massive payment for $18,400 explicitly coded in the ledger as comprehensive landscaping and groundskeeping renovations. The check had been cut to a company called Blue Ridge Botanical Solutions. Celeste, sitting beside me, crossed her arms. She explained that she had run a standard corporate registry check on Blue Ridge Botanical Solutions. The company was owned by a man who had been Audra's fiancé 5 years ago, a relationship that had ended in a spectacular, highly public disaster. But the truly damning detail was not the romantic history. It was the fact that Blue Ridge Botanical Solutions had been officially dissolved and had its business license permanently revoked by the state of North Carolina nearly 3 years before the invoice was ever generated. Audra had written an $18,400 check from the business account to a ghost entity, effectively laundering the money through a defunct shell company owned by a cooperative ex-boyfriend. Gideon then turned to the core of the commercial loan application to secure the massive $75,000 line of credit. Audra had been required to prove that the inn was a viable recovering business. She had submitted documents claiming an 85% average weekend occupancy rate over the preceding 6 months. Gideon cross-referenced these claims against the actual physical utility usage of the property. He looked at the water meter readings and the electricity consumption based on the actual resources being consumed. Gideon definitively concluded that the true occupancy rate hovered somewhere around 14%. She had essentially invented imaginary guests complete with imaginary payments to create the illusion of a thriving enterprise. Gideon folded his hands resting on the table. He looked at me with his cold, analytical eyes and delivered his final, absolute verdict. He stated that the Magnolia Trace Inn did not collapse because Faith Turner refused to sign a loan guarantee or because I abruptly withdrew my supposed corporate network. The business was completely hollowed out from the very beginning. It was a rotting carcass that had only been propped up by my constant emergency cash injections and Orber's spectacular delusions. As if the financial forensic evidence was not devastating enough, Celeste added the final layer of legal condemnation. She had employed a digital forensics expert to examine the metadata on the strategic meeting minutes Orber had submitted in her initial lawsuit complaint. These were the documents supposedly proving our 5,050 partnership, detailing long, intense strategy sessions we had supposedly held in the inn's dining room. The metadata unequivocally proved that every single one of those Word documents had been created entirely from scratch on a single Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 days after Orber had her very first consultation with her attorney, Mitchell Bryce. She had fabricated an entire history of corporate governance solely to legitimize her extortion attempt. I sat in the dim conference room, absorbing the sheer, overwhelming volume of the deceit. The anger was a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. But the final twist, the revelation that truly broke whatever fragile, lingering thread of attachment I still had to my family, came from a completely unexpected source on Gideon's flowchart. Gideon pointed his laser to a random Tuesday in late November. The inn's operating account had been overdrawn by nearly $12,000, largely due to Orber's aggressive personal spending. The account was 48 hours away from a cascade of bounce checks that would have alerted the vendors to the insolvency. Then, magically, a wire transfer for exactly $15,000 appeared, stabilizing the ledger just in time. I asked Gideon where the rescue funds had come from, assuming Orber had taken out yet another predatory, high-interest payday loan. Gideon shook his head. He pulled the routing information for the wire transfer. The money had come from a private individual retirement account. The account belonged to Diane Turner, my mother. The air in the room seemed to instantly evaporate. I could not breathe. My mother had not just been an innocent, naive bystander, desperately trying to keep the peace between two warring daughters. She had seen the catastrophic bank statements. She had known about the staggering, terrifying deficits. She had deliberately drained $15,000 of her own retirement security to plug a hole created by Orber's theft explicitly to keep the entire fraudulent operation hidden from me and hidden from the bank. She had actively participated in the cover-up. She had funded the illusion. When she had called me, weeping on the phone, begging me to just act like an adult and give Orber $10,000 for a lawyer, she already knew the business was a smoking crater. She knew Orber was a fraud. This single undeniable fact fundamentally altered the entire landscape of the war. I was no longer just fighting an irresponsible, vicious sister who was lashing out because she had finally been told no. I was fighting an entire entrenched ecosystem of lies. I was fighting a family structure that was entirely willing to sacrifice my sanity, my financial future, and my name simply because they had invested far too much of their own identity into the grand pathetic illusion of Orber's success. They were a cartel of enablers, and they had all agreed that I was the necessary casualty to keep their fantasy alive. I stood up from the conference table. I thanked Gideon for his time and his absolute precision. I looked at Celeste, who was already drafting the motion to counter-sue in her mind. I told her to file everything. I told her to hold absolutely nothing back. We were going to rip the beautiful paint completely off the walls and let the entire world see the rot underneath. Civil dockets are hopelessly clogged. Because of this, a judge will rarely allow a bitter familial dispute to consume valuable court time without first forcing the warring parties into a neutral space. We were ordered into mandatory mediation. For Celeste and me, this was a tactical checkpoint. For the Turner family, It was viewed as the grand finale, the final opportunity to bring everyone home and sweep the unpleasantness under a rug of shared blood. We met on a Tuesday morning in a rented conference room on the 20th floor of a neutral arbitration firm. The air conditioning was aggressively cold. I sat on one side of the massive glass table with Celeste. My parents, Orbra and Mitchell Bryce, sat precisely opposite us. Audra had dressed for the occasion with calculated brilliance. She wore a soft, oversized beige cashmere sweater and minimal makeup, looking pale and dangerously fragile. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring down at the table. She looked exactly like a woman who had been abandoned on the side of the road rather than the arsonist who had struck the match. My mother sat next to her, occasionally patting Audra's arm, projecting the image of a fiercely protective matriarch. Mitchell Bryce opened the session. He did not pound his fists or raise his voice. He employed the soothing, resonant tone of a reasonable man who just wanted to stop the bleeding. He acknowledged that the litigation had gotten out of hand. He stated that Audra had no desire to destroy her younger sister, and my parents simply wanted their family intact and their historic property secure. Then he slid a cleanly printed, stapled document across the polished glass. He called it a clean break agreement. Bryce outlined the terms. He stated that they were willing to entirely dismiss the $350,000 lawsuit with prejudice. In exchange, I would pay a much smaller flat settlement of $125,000. Audra would retain full uncontested ownership of the Magnolia Trace Inn, and our family could finally move forward. He pitched it as a magnificent bargain, a massive discount on my potential liability, all wrapped up in the warm goo of familial forgiveness. My mother leaned forward, her eyes brimming with hopeful tears, looking at me as if I had just been offered the absolute deal of a lifetime. I did not touch the document. I let it sit exactly in the center of the table. I looked at Celeste. Celeste picked up the packet. The room fell into a heavy suspended silence as she read. She did not skim. She read every single line with the cold mechanical precision of a bond disposal expert. I watched Mitchell Bryce's face beneath his calm, practiced exterior, a tiny muscle in his jaw twitched. It took Celeste exactly 4 minutes to find the wire. She flipped to the 6th page, her manicured nail tapping sharply against a dense block of text. She looked up, her expression completely devoid of amusement. She addressed Mitchell Bryce directly, asking him if he seriously thought she would let her client sign a blanket indemnification clause disguised as a standard release. My parents looked confused. Audra's posture instantly stiffened. Celeste did not wait for Bryce to answer. She turned to me and translated the legal jargon into razor, sharp English so the entire room could hear it. She explained that the clause did not just settle the lawsuit. It legally required me to indemnify and hold harmless Turner Heritage Hospitality along with its managing members against any and all future claims, debts, tax liabilities, and vendor disputes. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the trap clicked into place in my mind. The initial lawsuit for $350,000 was never real. It was a terrifying, towering decoy. Audra and her lawyer knew that number would send anyone into a panic. They had created a massive fictional threat so that when they finally offered me a 6-figure settlement, I would be so exhausted and so relieved that I would sign anything to make it go away. But the $125,000 was not the real prize. The real prize was the indemnification clause. If I signed that paper, I would become the absolute legally bound garbage disposal for Audra's catastrophic fraud. When the bank inevitably realized the $75,000 credit line was secured by stolen financial documents, I would be legally responsible for paying it back. When the Internal Revenue Service came looking for the taxes on the embezzled wedding deposits, the financial burden would fall squarely on my shoulders. When the defunct landscaping company was audited, I would be the one standing in the blast radius. Audra was not trying to settle a dispute. She was trying to hand me the steering wheel of a burning car just seconds before it went off a cliff, all while charging me over $100,000 for the privilege. I looked directly at my sister. The Fragile Victim Act was gone. Celeste tossed the drafted agreement back across the table. It slid and hit Bryce's watered glass with a sharp clink. Celeste stated plainly that the offer was not just rejected, but it was insulting. She explicitly mentioned that we were fully aware of the fraudulent credit line, the forged signatures, and the missing escrow funds. The air in the room instantly shattered. Order lost her temper. The serene, injured facade completely dissolved, replaced by a raw, venomous fury. She slammed her palms flat against the glass table, pushing herself upward. She screamed that I had more than enough money to fix this. Her voice echoed off the acoustic panels. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and blurted out the absolute truth, completely abandoning any pretense of a legal dispute. She yelled that if I had just done my part from the beginning, if I had just signed the commercial loan when she asked me to, none of this would have happened. There it was, the ultimate confession dragged into the harsh fluorescent light. It was never about a broken oral partnership. It was never about withheld corporate clients. It was purely and entirely about my refusal to be a compliant, silent wallet. Mitchell Bryce quickly reached out, grabbing Order's forearm, harshly whispering for her to sit down and be quiet. But the damage was permanently done. My mother, entirely ignoring the massive legal and financial implications of what had just been revealed, panicked at the sight of her golden child unraveling. Diane Turner dissolved into frantic, desperate tears. She reached her hands across the wide table, palms facing upward in a pleading gesture. She begged me. She sobbed that they were going to lose the house. She admitted out loud that the home equity line of credit she had taken out to pay Mitchell Bryce was suffocating them, and the inn was completely broke. She cried that I was the only one who could stop this. She pleaded with me to just sign the paper, to just pay the settlement, to save our family from losing the house and the inn at the exact same time. She was asking me to throw myself onto a live grenade to protect the person who had pulled the pin. I sat perfectly still. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single ounce of anger bleed into my tone. I simply looked at my weeping mother, my silent, cowardly father, and my esping sister. I said no. I turned to Celeste, my voice steady and cold. I gave her the explicit instruction right there in front of them. I told her to file the official counterclaim. I instructed her to file the motions for fraud, for identity theft, and for the recovery of all legal fees. I told her to burn their entire fabricated case to the ground. Mitchell Bryce's face turned an ashen shade of gray. He knew exactly what a counterclaim of that magnitude meant for his own professional liability, considering he had brought a case built on forged documents into a mediation room. I stood up from my leather chair and smoothed the front of my blazer. I did not wait for the mediator to formally close the session. As I walked toward the heavy wooden door, I glanced back one last time. My mother was sobbing into her hands. My father was staring at the floor. Order was glaring at me with a hatred so pure and unfiltered it was almost blinding. They looked at me as if I were a monster. They looked at me as if I had just committed the ultimate unforgivable act of betrayal against my own blood. But as I turned the brass handle and stepped out of the freezing conference room into the quiet carpeted hallway, the crushing weight I had carried since childhood completely vanished. For the very first time in my 36 years of existence, their absolute disapproval meant nothing to me. They thought I was destroying the family, but I knew the absolute truth. For the first time in my life, I was finally saving myself. The legal machinery was fully in motion, grinding inevitably toward a preliminary hearing scheduled for 9:00 on a Thursday morning. This was not a trial, but it was the judicial crucible where the judge would examine the legal merits of Order's complaint and the terrifying weight of our massive counterclaim. If Celeste and I executed our strategy flawlessly, the judge would dismiss their case with prejudice right from the bench. Exactly 48 hours before I was supposed to walk into the county courthouse, my phone vibrated on my office desk. The caller ID displayed a name that genuinely shocked me. It was Mara Ellis. Mara is the daughter of my Aunt Paula. She is exactly 2 years younger than I am. A quiet, hyper-organized woman who had spent her entire life carefully navigating the treacherous, emotional minefields of our extended family by simply remaining invisible. Whenever my mother and my aunt got into a vicious argument over holiday plans, Mara was the one quietly doing the dishes, refusing to take a side. But more importantly, Mara had briefly served as the freelance bookkeeper for the Magnolia Trace Inn during its first 6 months of operation, right before the financial rot truly set in. I answered the phone cautiously. Mara did not bother with pleasantries. Her voice was trembling, tight with an anxiety that sounded almost physically painful. She told me she had heard through the family grapevine about what happened at the mediation. She knew my parents were loudly blaming me for the impending collapse of the estate. Then she took a sharp, ragged breath and confessed that she could no longer remain neutral because her neutrality was starting to feel exactly like complicity. Mara explained that when she abruptly quit the bookkeeping job last November, she did not just hand over the physical ledgers to Audra, being a meticulous, deeply cautious professional who had already sensed the impending disaster. Mara had quietly downloaded a complete encrypted backup of the inn's administrative cloud drive to protect her own professional liability. She emailed me a secure link before she hung up the phone. I immediately forwarded the encrypted file to Celeste. Within an hour, I was sitting back in her glass-walled office, watching a progress bar slowly fill across her computer monitor as the cloud data unpacked itself. The archive was a digital gold mine, a perfectly preserved snapshot of my sister's absolute desperation. But the true explosive payload was buried in a subfolder labeled strictly for administrative voicemails. It was an audio file apparently generated when Audra had accidentally left the office communication system recording during a private late-night meeting. Celeste clicked play. The room filled with the unmistakable, slightly distorted voices of my sister and my mother. The recording was dated 4 months prior to Mitchell Bryce filing the civil complaint. On the tape, Audra was in a state of sheer panic, her voice rising in pitch as she told my mother that the County Revenue Board was formally threatening a comprehensive occupancy tax audit within the next 90 days. Audra confessed that she had completely mismanaged the tax escrows, using the municipal funds to pay for her luxury personal credit card bills. Furthermore, she admitted that 3 different furious brides were actively threatening to file independent lawsuits over unreturned event deposits. Then came the killing blow. My mother's voice filtered through the speakers, hushed and conspiratorial. Diane Turner asked how they could possibly fix the massive deficit before the bank discovered the fraud. Audra's response was chilling in its calculated malice. She stated verbatim that they just needed to create enough paper to scare Faith into signing a settlement before the bank looked closely. She told my mother that if they hit me with a massive, terrifying lawsuit, I would panic and agree to assume the business debts just to make the public embarrassment go away. It was premeditated, documented extortion. My own mother had sat in that room and actively conspired to use the legal system to terrorize me into paying for my sister's impending criminal tax liability. As if the audio file were not enough to ensure Mitchell Bryce's complete professional ruin, Mara's cloud backup also contained the definitive proof regarding the forged text messages. Celeste found an email chain between Audra's private account and a freelance graphic designer based out of state. The emails contained the exact dialogue Audra wanted to appear in the fake text messages, along with explicit instructions to the designer to make the screenshots look as authentic as possible to an Android operating system. There was even a digital invoice for $300 attached to the final email marked as paid in full. Celeste paused the audio player and leaned back in her chair. Her eyes were completely dark, devoid of any standard legal detachment. She looked at me and declared that we were no longer just aiming for a simple dismissal. With Mara's digital archive, Gideon's forensic accounting, and the irrefutable metadata, we possessed the absolute power to have Audra investigated for felony fraud and perjury. Celeste began organizing the exhibits, treating the upcoming hearing not as a defensive legal maneuver, but as a heavily armed ambush. The night before the hearing, the protective adrenaline completely abandoned me, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, staring blankly at the shadows stretching across the hardwood floor. Noah walked into the bedroom and sat down beside me. He did not offer any empty, overly optimistic platitudes. He did not tell me that everything was going to be all right or that the truth would effortlessly set me free. He understood the psychological mechanics of trauma far too well for that. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders and pulled me close. He spoke softly into the quiet room. Noah told me that the hardest part of tomorrow was not going to be facing the judge or listening to Mitchell Bryce tell desperate lies in an open courtroom. He said the true agony, the absolute heaviest burden I would have to carry, was walking into that room and finally permanently accepting who my family really was. The illusion was dead. Tomorrow, I had to look at my parents and my sister and accept that they were entirely willing to destroy my life to preserve their own comfort. I slept for maybe 2 hours that night. I woke up long before the sun crested the horizon. The morning routine was entirely mechanical. I showered, drank a single cup of black coffee, and walked into my closet. I did not dress like a victim seeking the court's gentle mercy. I pulled a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit from its hanger. I buttoned the crisp white blouse entirely to the collar. I pulled my hair back into a severe, immovable knot at the nape of my neck. I looked in the mirror, and the woman staring back at me was a complete stranger to the Turner family. She was not the quiet shadow who cleaned up the messes. She was not the infinite reliable resource they could bleed dry at their convenience. I picked up my leather briefcase, the heavy brass clasps clicking securely shut. I walked out of my apartment, took the elevator down to the parking garage, and drove toward the downtown courthouse. The sky was a pale, clear blue, completely devoid of morning clouds. I walked through the heavy metal detectors and rode the elevator to the 4th floor. When I stepped out into the long, polished corridor, I saw them. My mother, my father, Audra, and their attorney were huddled together on a wooden bench outside the courtroom doors. They looked up as I approached, their faces tight with a mixture of nervous anticipation and deeply ingrained entitlement. They still believed they were the main characters of this tragedy. They still believed I was about to break. I did not stop to speak to them. I did not even break my stride. I walked past them with my eyes fixed straight ahead, pushing open the heavy brass-handled doors of the courtroom. I was not walking in there to ask for an apology, and I was certainly not walking in there to seek their understanding. I was walking in there to end them. The air inside courtroom 4 was heavy with the sterile, intimidating scent of lemon polish and aged wood. This was not a place for emotional manipulation or tearful family theater. It was a theater of absolute, unforgiving facts. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for possessing zero tolerance for frivolous civil complaints, sat high behind the mahogany bench. Mitchell Bryce stood up first, attempting to seize control of the narrative before we could detonate our arsenal. He buttoned his expensive navy suit and offered the judge a polite, deferential smile. He deliberately softened his voice, trying to paint a picture of a tragic, unfortunate familial misunderstanding. He argued that the court did not need to delve into harsh penalties because this was simply a case of mismatched investment expectations between two sisters who had tried and failed to run a hospitality business. He kept using words like emotional distress, sibling rivalry, and miscommunication, desperately trying to keep the argument anchored in the murky waters of feelings rather than the concrete realm of intentional fraud. He wanted the judge to view Audra as a naive, grieving entrepreneur, not a calculated extortionist. When it was our turn, Celeste Wynne did not stand up and offer polite smiles. She approached the podium with the cold mechanical grace of an executioner. She did not argue about feelings. She argued about data. Celeste opened her binder and immediately attacked the foundational pillar of Audra's lawsuit, the supposed text message agreements. She submitted the comprehensive digital forensics report into evidence. She clearly directed the judge's attention to the metadata of the screenshots Audra had provided. Celeste pointed out with razor-sharp articulation that the creation dates embedded in the image files proved those text bubbles were entirely manufactured on a Tuesday afternoon exactly 5 days after Audra had first retained Mitchell Bryce. The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression hardening instantly as she looked down at the irrefutable proof of fabricated evidence. Mitchell Bryce shifted uncomfortably in his chair, a thin layer of sweat forming on his forehead. But Celeste was just getting started. She called Gideon Vale to the stand. Gideon, wearing his standard gray suit and an expression of utter boredom, meticulously walked the court through the financial autopsy of the Magnolia Trace Inn. He did not need to raise his voice. The numbers did the screaming for him. He presented the bank statements demonstrating how client wedding deposits were illegally diverted into Orber's personal checking account within hours of clearing. He highlighted the ghost invoices, specifically the $18,400 payment to a completely defunct landscaping company owned by Orber's former fiancée. He exposed the fraudulent loan application, proving the inn's occupancy rate was closer to 14%, entirely destroying Orber's claim of an 85% success rate. Gideon concluded his testimony by stating that my refusal to provide a corporate network or sign a loan guarantee did not kill the business. The business, he testified under oath, was a hollow shell that had been systematically looted by its own operator. Audra stared at the defense table, her face completely drained of color. My parents sat in the gallery right behind her, perfectly silent, the horrifying reality of their golden child's actions finally being broadcast in a public forum. Then Celeste called Mar Ellis. My cousin walked down the center aisle, gripping her purse tightly, refusing to make eye contact with my mother or my aunt. Mara sat in the witness box, swore to tell the truth, and handed over the encrypted audio file she had recovered from the cloud backup. Celeste played the audio file for the entire courtroom. The recording echoed off the high ceiling. Everyone in the room heard my sister panicking about a looming tax audit. Everyone heard my sister confessed to draining the municipal tax escrows to pay her personal credit cards. And most devastatingly, everyone heard my own mother's voice, hushed and conspiratorial, actively agreeing to create enough legal paper to terrify me into signing a settlement and absorbing the debt. Mara then calmly testified that Orber had explicitly ordered her to clean the escrow ledgers to hide the missing funds before she abruptly quit. Mitchell Bryce looked physically ill. He had brought a civil dispute to court only to realize he was sitting next to a client who was actively providing grounds for a criminal indictment. But Celeste had saved the heaviest, most lethal blow for the very end. She submitted the state registry records for Turner Heritage, Hospitality, and the corresponding IP access logs subpoenaed from the Internet service provider. She placed a large printed diagram on the easel. She demonstrated that the digital portal used to formally establish the limited liability company and the portal used to apply for the $75,000 commercial line of credit were accessed exclusively from a device matching the unique MAC address of Orber's personal laptop. Furthermore, the digital signature stamp bearing my name lacked any two-factor authentication token. It had simply been dragged and dropped onto the final PDF. Celeste looked directly at Mitchell Bryce, then up at the judge. She stated unequivocally that Faith Turner was never a partner, never a managing member, and never an authorized guarantor. She stated that the plaintiff had committed severe identity theft and bank fraud, and was now attempting to use the judicial system to force the victim to pay for the crime. The pressure inside the room reached a breaking point. Audra could no longer maintain the fragile, injured facade. The meticulously crafted victim narrative completely shattered under the crushing weight of public humiliation and undeniable proof. Audra abruptly pushed her chair back, the wooden legs screeching loudly against the polished floor. She stood up, her face flushed dark red, tears of absolute, unfiltered rage streaming down her cheeks. She ignored Mitchell Bryce's frantic whispers to sit down. She pointed directly at me and screamed, her voice echoing wildly in the austere space. She yelled that it was not fair. She shrieked that I always got the easy road, that I always had the money, the respect, and the perfect life. She completely abandoned the lie about broken contracts and business partnerships. In front of the judge, the bailiff, and the court reporter, Orber screamed that I always had everything that was supposed to be hers. It was the raw, ugly truth, finally dragged into the light. Her motive was never about seeking justice for a ruined business. It was about a lifetime of deep, festering, unmanageable envy. The judge slammed her gavel down with terrifying force, demanding immediate order. She glared at Audra with absolute disgust. The ruling was swift and completely merciless. The judge dismissed Audra's civil complaint entirely with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again, but she did not stop there. The judge immediately granted my counterclaim in full. ordering Orbra to pay 100% of my legal fees. Before adjourning, the judge looked directly at Mitchell Bryce and stated that she was forwarding the transcripts, the audio files, and the financial forensics to the district attorney's office with a strong recommendation to open a formal investigation into perjury, wire fraud, and identity theft. Mitchell Bryce packed his briefcase with trembling hands. His professional reputation was entirely in ruins. He had allowed himself to be blinded by a potential payout, failing to properly vet his own client, and he had just dragged forged documents into a court of law. He walked out without saying a single word to my sister. I gathered my coat in my purse. I felt an incredible, weightless sensation spreading through my chest. The war was officially over. I walked out of the courtroom and stepped into the wide, brightly lit corridor. My parents were waiting by the elevators. They looked exhausted, broken, and suddenly very old. Diane and Russell Turner stepped into my path, completely ignoring the fact that they had just been exposed as co-conspirators in an extortion plot against their own daughter. My mother reached out, her hands shaking, her voice cracking as she tried to revert to her old established scripts. She told me she was sorry things got out of hand. She begged me to understand that they only went along with it because they were terrified. She said they just wanted to save the family. I stopped. I did not yell. I did not feel the need to argue. I looked at the two people who had spent my entire life treating my stability as a resource to be minded for Orbra's benefit. I looked my mother directly in the eyes and delivered my final words to her. I told her in a perfectly calm, steady voice that a family is not a place where someone is pushed into a dark corner, held hostage, and then demanded to pay for the privilege of being trapped in that corner. I stepped around them, pressed the call button for the elevator, and never looked back. The aftermath was swift and absolute. I fully recovered the massive legal costs I had incurred, forcing Orbra into personal bankruptcy to satisfy the judgment. The bank, alerted by the court's findings, immediately called in the fraudulent $75,000 loan. With no capital and no credit, the Magnolia Trace Inn was seized and forced into a public asset sale to clear the debts, permanently ending my parents' delusional Southern dream. Orbra lost her status, her stolen money, and her carefully crafted victim narrative. For the very first time in her completely shielded life, she was left standing entirely alone in the wreckage she had created, with absolutely no one coming to rescue her. As I walked out of the courthouse doors and into the bright, clear afternoon sunlight, I did not throw my hands up in a victory cheer. I did not feel the triumphant, gloating rush of a winner. I simply took a deep breath of the crisp city air. I felt like a prisoner who had just stepped outside the high walls for the first time in 36 years. I had not just won a lawsuit. I had finally permanently lifted that crushing weight from my own shoulders. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the very end. Please leave a comment down below letting me know where in the world you are listening to this story from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.